In the ancient, sun-drenched city, where the dust of the desert met the salt of the sea, a young merchant named Elias navigated a world of shifting shadows and dishonest weights. While his peers were consumed by the pursuit of gold at any cost, Elias was driven by a different currency, integrity. He believed that a name built on truth was more valuable than a vault filled with silver. His stall in the busy district was a beacon of order, a place where scales were always balanced and words were as solid as the city's ancient stretching walls. Elias knew that building a reputation took a lifetime, but could be shattered in a single moment of weakness. Yet even the most upright tree must face the howling wind, and for Elias, that wind was a man named Silas. Silas was a man who seemed to have stepped directly out of the cautionary tales of Solomon. He was a scorner, a man whose pride was his armor and whose tongue was a jagged, cruel blade. Silas thrived on the chaos that Elias sought to soothe. He was loud, his voice booming over the peaceful negotiations of the market, and he was arrogant beyond measure. To Silas, a quiet man was weak, and a man of God was simply a target for ridicule. He didn't just want to compete with Elias, he wanted to dismantle the foundation of his character. Initially, Elias approached the problem with the idealism of youth. He believed that even the most hardened heart could be softened by a gentle response. When Silas shouted, Elias spoke softly. When Silas disrupted a sale with claims of poor quality, Elias would calmly present his ledgers and invite Silas to see the truth. He thought logic was a bridge any man would cross if it were built well. He believed a kind gesture could quench the fire of a fool's anger. But Silas did not want a bridge. He wanted a battlefield. He viewed Elias's patience as a sign of cowardice, and it only fueled his perverse desire to see the merchant break. The turning point came on a day when the heat was particularly oppressive, making every nerve feel raw. The marketplace was a sea of moving bodies, the air thick with the smell of parched earth and livestock. Silas positioned himself in front of Elias's shop, his face flushed with a malicious sort of glee. He began to weave a tapestry of insults, moving from Elias's business to his family and, eventually, his faith. He mocked the God Elias served, painting the merchant's devotion as a mask for inherent weakness. Elias felt the heat rising in his own chest, a boiling anger that threatened to spill over and drown his principles. His hands, usually steady as he measured out grain, were trembling with the urge to silence the man. He wanted to shout back, to expose Silas's own failures, to strike him down with the same vitriol being hurled his way. The internal conflict was a storm. On one side stood the man Elias wanted to be, the man of God who walked in peace, and on the other stood a man who felt the primal need to defend his honor. In that moment of near collapse, the memory of his old mentor surfaced. The mentor had once warned Elias about the nature of those who love strife. He had told him that the mouth of a fool is his own destruction, and that his lips are the snare of his soul. To engage with such a man on his own terms was to invite that same destruction upon oneself. The mentor's voice reminded him that some people do not seek the truth, they seek a reaction. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The crowd had gathered now, forming a tight, expectant circle around the two men. The silence was heavy, pressing against Elias from all sides. Silas, seeing that he had captured the city's attention, leaned forward until his face was inches from Elias's. With a grin that held no warmth, he delivered a scandalous, fabricated accusation, claiming that Elias had been seen stealing from the temple treasury. The charge was blasphemous. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and every eye turned to Elias, waiting for the young man to respond. The accusation of theft from the holy treasury was more than a lie. It was a calculated strike at the very soul of Elias's reputation. For a long, agonizing moment, Elias stood frozen, the heartbeat thrumming in his ears like a war drum. He took a steadying breath, his mind racing to find the right words, the logical rebuttal that would dismantle Silas's venomous claim. He stepped forward, his voice calm but strained, and addressed the gathered townspeople. He spoke of his records, of the witnesses who knew his whereabouts, and of the fundamental impossibility of such a crime. He tried to appeal to their shared history, their years of fair dealings and mutual respect. But logic is a frail shield against a storm of shouting. Silas did not wait for Elias to finish. He did not care for facts or timelines. Instead, he laughed, a harsh, braying sound that cut through Elias's explanation like a sickle through wheat. Every time Elias attempted to present a rational point, Silas would twist the words, shouting over him with even more outrageous claims. When Elias spoke of integrity, Silas screamed about hypocrisy. When Elias mentioned his faith, Silas mocked the pious thief who prayed with one hand and stole with the other. The crowd, once a group of friends and neighbors, began to waver. They were drawn to the volume and the drama of the conflict, finding Silas's theatrical outrage more compelling than Elias's measured reason. Solomon's ancient warning echoed in the back of Elias's mind. A fool's voice is known by a multitude of words. The pressure became unbearable as the whispers of the crowd turned into pointed stares and suspicious murmurs. Something inside Elias finally fractured. The constant barrage of insults, the injustice of the lie, and the sheer exhaustion of trying to be the better man converged into a single explosive moment of weakness. He stepped into Silas's space, his face flushed with a dark, unfamiliar rage. With a voice that shook the very air, Elias roared a command for silence, his words laced with a bitterness that tasted like copper. For a split second, he looked exactly like the man Silas wanted him to be. In that heartbeat of lost composure, Silas simply smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. Nearby, several men, associates of Silas and corrupt officials who had been lingering in the shadows, shared a knowing glance. They had caught the man of God in a moment of unbridled anger, a brief lapse they could now use to paint him as unstable and dangerous. The crowd dispersed as the sun began its slow descent, leaving Elias alone in the center of the dusty square. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. A profound sense of shame washed over him, a cold tide that extinguished the remnants of his anger. He felt a deep, spiritual nausea for having descended to Silas's level. By engaging the fool on the fool's terms, he had allowed his own character to be stained by the very filth he sought to avoid. He realized with a sinking heart that his attempt to change Silas through kindness had been a form of arrogance, a belief that his goodness alone was enough to overcome a heart dedicated to mockery. As he sat on a stone bench, his head in his hands, a shadow fell across him. A man he did not recognize, wrapped in a travel-worn cloak that smelled of cedar and old parchment, stood before him. Without a word, the stranger reached into the folds of his garment and produced a scroll, its edges frayed and its seal made of dark, heavy wax. The stranger pressed the object into Elias's trembling hands and whispered that some battles are won by the sword, but the most dangerous are won by the scroll. Before Elias could ask who he was or what this meant, the figure vanished into the darkening alleys of the city. Elias retreated to his home, lighting a small oil lamp to examine the gift. As he broke the seal and unfurled the vellum, the words of the secrets of the king began to burn into his consciousness. The text spoke of the different paths of the heart and the necessity of boundaries. He began to understand a painful truth. His goodness had been weaponized against him. By being perpetually open and accommodating, he had essentially handed Silas the keys to his peace. He had been casting his pearls before swine, and the swine were now trampling them into the mud, just as the ancient wisdom had warned. The merchant realized that his integrity required more than just honesty. It required the discernment to know when to speak and when to bar the door. The night was short and filled with the ghosts of his mistakes. Just as the first light of dawn touched the city walls, a loud banging erupted at Elias's front gate. He opened it to find Silas standing there, flanked by two men in the official robes of the city's legal council. Silas looked triumphant, holding a set of stamped documents that fluttered in the morning breeze. With a sneer, he announced that a formal petition had been filed to seize Elias's business and holdings. The claim was based on Elias's violent outburst in the square, which Silas used as evidence that the merchant was mentally unstable and unfit to manage his affairs. The trap was no longer just social, it was legal, and the very goodness Elias prized was being used as the primary witness against him. Elias packed a small rucksack and left the city before the morning market could stir. The legal documents Silas had brandished were a death sentence for his livelihood, but he knew he could not fight this in the streets or with the same desperation that Silas possessed. He needed the silence that only the jagged rocks and whispering pines of the high desert could provide. As he walked, the echoes of Silas's braying laughter faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under his sandals. He reached a secluded valley where the wind carried no human lies. There, beneath the shade of an ancient terebinth tree, Elias unrolled the mysterious scroll given to him by the stranger. The secrets of the king did not offer comforting platitudes. Instead, it offered a razor-sharp anatomy of the human heart. Elias read about the three faces of folly that Solomon had identified. First was the simpleton, the one who is merely gullible and lacks experience. Such a person could be guided with patience and instruction. Then came the self-confident fool, the man who believes his own intuition is infallible, rejecting any wisdom that does not mirror his own desires. He is a wall that no truth can penetrate, making him a dangerous companion on any journey. But it was the third category that made Elias's blood run cold: the scorner. The scroll described the scorner as a creature who does not merely stumble into error, but delights in the destruction of others. To a scorner, peace is an enemy and chaos is a throne. They do not want to be right, they want to be dominant. They mock what is holy and use the sincerity of others as a weapon. Elias saw Silas's face in every line of the text. Silas wasn't just a rival merchant, he was a scorner whose very nature sought to contaminate the integrity of anyone who stood in his path. The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. He had been trying to treat a scorner like a simpleton, hoping that logic or kindness would pierce a heart that was purposefully hardened against both. In the stillness of the wilderness, Elias understood that his definition of goodness had been dangerously incomplete. He had mistaken passivity for piety. True discernment, the scroll argued, was not about being universally nice to everyone, regardless of their fruit. It was about recognizing the nature of the soil you were planting in. He saw now that Silas was not a man to be argued with or convinced, but a man to be contained and avoided. This wasn't a lack of love, it was the highest form of spiritual stewardship. He began to see Silas not as a powerful giant, but as a victim of his own rotting character, bound by chains of his own making. Elias looked back at the months of conflict, the sleepless nights, and the public humiliations. He realized he had been the one to provide the fuel for Silas's fire. By engaging in the marketplace brawls and trying to defend his honor against a man who had no honor, he had essentially cast his pearls before a beast that could only trample them. He had spent his energy trying to decorate a pig's ear with gold, only to be bitten for his efforts. The scroll taught him that protection of the holy is a duty, not an act of selfishness. He had allowed the sacred things in his life, his peace and his reputation, to be treated as common garbage. After 3 days, the transformation was complete. Elias did not look like a man fleeing a legal challenge. He looked like a man who had already seen the end of the story. His eyes, once darting with the anxiety of a hunted animal, were now steady and clear. He rolled up the scroll, tucking it securely into his tunic, and began the descent back toward the city. He didn't carry a sword, yet he felt more armed than he ever had before. His mind was no longer a battlefield of reactive emotions, but a fortress of calculated, holy calm. As Elias passed through the heavy iron gates of the city, the atmosphere changed. Word of his return spread quickly through the stalls and alleys. Friends who had pitied him and enemies who had already begun to divide his assets watched him with confusion. Silas was already at his usual spot in the center of the square, holding court with the corrupt officials, his voice booming as he detailed his plans for Elias's properties. But as Elias walked past, he didn't stop. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't offer a rebuttal or a plea. He walked with a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow the noise around him. Silas's laughter faltered mid-sentence. There was something in Elias's stride, a cold, unwavering focus that made the scorner's skin crawl with an instinctive, unexplainable fear. The merchant was back, but the man Silas knew how to break was gone. Elias walked through the marketplace not as a victim, but as a sentinel of his own peace. Silas was waiting. He had prepared a new set of insults, sharpened like daggers to pierce the armor of Elias's reputation. As Elias approached his own stall, Silas stepped into his path, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. He began to shout, his voice echoing against the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, accusing Elias of cowardice for fleeing to the wilderness. He threw out barbs about the merchant's father and his failed ventures, his spit flying in the dry air. But Elias did not break his stride. He did not look up. He moved with a rhythmic, intentional grace, setting out his wares as if Silas were nothing more than the buzzing of a fly. This was the first lesson of the scroll, the power of selective silence. By refusing to enter the ring, Elias denied Silas the oxygen he needed to keep his fire burning. The crowd, expecting a spectacle of shouting and rage, found themselves watching a man who seemed to exist in a different reality. Untouched by the storm, the absence of a reaction acted like a mirror, reflecting Silas's own ugliness back at him. For 3 days, Silas increased the intensity of his provocations. He stood outside Elias's shop from dawn until dusk, his insults becoming increasingly absurd and shrill. He began to pace like a caged animal, his movements jerky and his eyes wild with a growing desperation. The scorner requires an audience and a victim who validates his power through fear or anger. Without Elias's participation, Silas was merely a man shouting at a wall. The city began to whisper. People who had once laughed at Silas's jokes now looked at him with a mixture of pity and irritation. His erratic behavior started to alienate even his closest associates among the corrupt officials. They had backed him because he was a useful tool for chaos, but a tool that could not be controlled was a liability. Silas, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, became even more desperate to elicit a response, his once calculated malice devolving into a frantic, incoherent madness that stained his every word and action. While Silas spiraled, Elias practiced the second lesson of the king, the gathering of coals of fire. When a shipment of grain meant for Silas's stall was accidentally overturned in the mud near the northern gate, it was Elias who quietly sent his own workers to help salvage the ruin. When Silas's youngest child fell ill with a fever, Elias left a jar of expensive healing oils on their doorstep, anonymous yet unmistakable in its quality. These were not acts of weakness, but tactical strikes of mercy. Each gesture of kindness was a coal placed upon Silas's head, not to burn him with heat, but to expose the coldness of his own heart. The community, always observant of the subtle shifts in social tides, began to see a stark, undeniable contrast. On one side was a man of quiet dignity and unearned grace. On the other was a man of loud vitriol and baseless hatred. The narrative Silas had carefully constructed of Elias as the unstable, fraudulent merchant was crumbling under the weight of Elias's persistent, silent integrity. The truth was becoming visible, not through a loud defense, but through a lived reality. However, the shadows were deeper than Elias had initially realized. While he focused on his spiritual discipline, Silas's desperation had driven him to finalize his darkest gambit. Through a sympathetic clerk in the city's record house, Elias caught wind of a secret meeting between Silas and corrupt officials. They were moving to physically seize his ancestral land. Under the cover of night, Elias began his own investigation. In a dusty backroom, he discovered a ledger detailing illegal payments from Silas. More than that, it contained a forged deed to his property, signed with a clumsy imitation of his signature. As he held the document, the weight of the evidence pressed against his palms. Silas had committed a high crime, carrying the penalty of exile. Elias stood in the dim light of the lamp, the path to Silas's total destruction laid out, the weight of the forged document, and the ancient, yellowed parchment felt like cold stone in Elias's hands. Standing in the dim light of the back room, the ink testified to a betrayal that went far beyond mere business rivalry. Silas had not just tried to win. He had tried to erase Elias's existence, his heritage, and his future. The evidence was absolute. In the eyes of the law, this parchment was a death sentence for Silas's reputation and a one-way ticket to exile. Yet as Elias stared at the crooked, forged signature, a profound internal struggle began to churn within him. He was a student of the king's wisdom, and the scrolls spoke of justice, but they also spoke of the complex condition of the human heart. Elias sat alone as the moon climbed the city walls, the silence of the night pressing against him. The shadows of the trees danced like ghosts across the courtyard. He remembered the old mentor's voice saying that mercy without boundaries is merely an invitation to further evil. Handing the document to authorities was justice, but was it the path of wisdom? He was trapped in the delicate space between redemption and retribution. He did not want Silas's blood on his hands, nor did he want to see a family destroyed. Yet the scroll was clear: drive out the scorner, so that strife may cease. To allow Silas to continue his path was to allow a cancer to grow. Elias realized his desire to be seen as good had often shielded a secret fear of taking a stand. He sought out Silas the next evening, finding him alone counting coins behind his stall. The smell of dry dust and old metal hung in the air. Silas didn't shout, he merely sneered with practiced contempt. Elias produced the forged deed, holding it so the oil lamp caught the ink. He told Silas quietly that he knew of the bribe, the clerk, and the forgery. He offered a simple path. Silas could confess his error, return the stolen promises, and leave the city in peace. It was a moment of pure grace, a final bridge offered over a widening chasm. He hoped for a spark of humanity, a flicker of remorse that might save Silas from his own path of total destruction. Silas's reaction was not one of fear or even momentary shame. It was a visceral, violent explosion of vitriol. He spat at Elias's feet, his face contorting with a mask of pure hatred. The veins in Silas's neck bulged with the effort of his rage. He laughed, a jagged sound echoing through the empty stalls. He mocked Elias's pious mercy, calling it the cowardice of a weak man too afraid to strike. Silas claimed the judges were already in his pocket, and that Elias would soon be the one begging for scraps in the dirt. It was the classic mark of the fool, a man who returns to his own folly like a dog to its vomit, unable to perceive mercy because his heart is entirely consumed by the flame of pride. A heavy weight lifted from Elias's shoulders. The merchant felt the cool night air breathe new life into his lungs as he realized the mysterious stranger's scroll was right. Some hearts are so hardened, they see kindness only as an opening to cause more pain. He could not fix Silas. He could not save a man who was determined to set himself on fire just to see his neighbor burn. The emotional toll of trying to bridge the gap had been his own self-imposed prison. Now he finally understood that true discernment meant recognizing when the time for talk had ended. He folded the document and walked away, leaving Silas shouting into the darkness, his words becoming increasingly incoherent as he spiraled further into his own delusions. The morning of the legal hearing arrived under a sky the color of bruised iron. The city was hushed with the anticipation of a final reckoning. The heavy oak doors of the hall groaned as they were pushed open. Elias, dressed in simple linen, carrying only the truth and the hidden evidence. He knew Silas had spent the night whispering to corrupt officials, sharpening a final devastating lie. Silas intended to claim that Elias had stolen the treasury funds and then attempted to murder him in the garden. It was a desperate, scorched earth tactic designed to ruin the merchant forever. As Elias stepped into the courtroom, the gaze of the judge fell upon him, heavy with the weight of the coming decision. The courtroom was a cavernous hall of polished stone. The judge sat upon a high dais, his face a mask of gravity, while the city's elders gathered in the shadows. Silas moved to the center of the floor with the swagger of a man who believed the world was his stage. He looked polished, his robes fine, and his beard neatly trimmed, a stark contrast to Elias. The merchant Elias stood at his station, hands resting lightly at his sides, his breathing slow. He felt the weight of the scroll in his tunic, a silent witness to the truth. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the sweat of a growing crowd. The merchant Elias remained poised, his eyes focused on a distant point beyond the walls. When the judge signaled for Silas to speak, the scorner erupted with a performance that would have put actors to shame. He spoke of nights filled with fear, of Elias lurking in the shadows, and of the merchant's supposed embezzlement from the whole city's common fund. Silas's voice rose and fell with practiced emotion. He painted a picture of a man who had fallen from grace, a merchant whose integrity was a shroud for a black heart. Silas looked at the judge, his eyes wide, claiming that Elias had offered him a bribe the night before. Every word was a masterful distortion, a web woven with threads of half-truths and malice. As Silas continued his tirade, all eyes turned to Elias. They expected a roar of denial or a desperate plea for mercy. But Elias remained as still as a statue. He remembered the proverb about not answering a fool according to his folly, lest he become like him. To argue against such frantic lies would only be to descend into the mud where Silas was most comfortable. By speaking, Elias would have validated the chaos. Instead, his silence acted as a mirror. The more he said nothing, the more Silas felt the need to fill the void. The scorner began to pace. He added more details and dates, desperate to provoke a reaction. The silence in the room became heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on Silas's shoulders. In this excess of speech, the fool's trap began to close. Silas, intoxicated by his own voice, began to trip over his narrative. He mentioned an hour when Elias had supposedly attacked him that contradicted the testimony of the gate guards he had earlier cited to prove Elias's absence. He spoke of a ledger he claimed Elias had burned, only to later claim it was hidden in a location he had already described as being under his own constant surveillance. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowing as the inconsistencies piled up. The spectators realized that the man who spoke the most was revealing the least amount of truth. Silas was drowning in a sea of his own making. Only when the judge turned his gaze to Elias did the merchant step forward. He reached into his tunic and produced the forged deed and the ledger of bribes. He handed them to the official in silence. This was the response according to the fool's folly. Not a shouting match, but the presentation of a reality that Silas could not ignore. The judge's eyes scanned the forged signature and the records of illegal payments, his mouth set in a hard line. Seeing the tide turn, the corrupt officials who had stood behind Silas shifted positions. One by one, they offered clarifications to the judge, distancing themselves. The clerk from the record house confessed to the forgery. Silas turned on them, his frantic face losing color. The judge's gavel struck the wood. Silas was ordered into exile. As guards moved in, Silas let out a final curse, his voice cracking with malice. He looked at Elias, expecting triumph. Instead, he saw only a deep, quiet peace. Elias felt no joy in the man's destruction, for he knew the cost of such a soul. As the doors closed behind the shouting fool, Elias stood in the center of the hall, the weight of the conflict finally gone, replaced by the calm of a man who had walked through the fire without the smell of smoke on his clothes. The morning after the legal trial, the city marketplace felt different, as if a thick, choking fog had been swept away by a cleansing desert wind. Elias returned to his stall, but he did not return to the same life he had lived before the conflict. His business restoration was total. Those who had once whispered in the shadows approached him with newfound quiet respect, their eyes filled with a silent apology they didn't know how to voice. His trade flourished, expanding far beyond the city gates. Gold in his coffers was not his greatest treasure. The true wealth was the clarity that resided in his soul, a stillness that no external storm could disturb again. Elias began to see his life not as an open field where anyone could wander and trample the grass, but as a sacred garden protected by a sturdy wall. This was the lesson of the wall. The realization that spiritual boundaries are not an act of cruelty, but a mandatory necessity for survival in a broken world. He understood now that to love one's neighbor did not mean allowing that neighbor to set fire to your home. He learned to identify the early, subtle signs of a fool's presence, hidden arrogance and a hungry need for chaos. By building these boundaries, he wasn't shutting the world out. He was inviting peace in. He ensured only those who valued truth could enter his circle. In the quiet hours of the late evening, Elias often reflected on the difficult and vital difference between forgiveness and trust. He had forgiven Silas. He bore no hatred toward the exiled man, for he realized that Silas was a prisoner trapped in a cage of his own pride. To carry a grudge would be to keep a piece of Silas's darkness inside him. However, Elias also knew that forgiveness did not require the immediate restoration of trust. Trust was a bridge that had to be rebuilt stone by stone. This distinction allowed Elias to move forward with a heart that was light and free, yet with eyes wide open to the reality of nature. The transformation from a man who reacts to a man who responds was finally complete. When a rival tried to bait him with insults, Elias no longer felt that prick of defensive anger in his chest. Instead, he would pause, breathe deeply, and look for the true nature of the heart standing before him. If he saw a simpleton, he offered patient instruction. If he saw a wise man, he offered sincere and careful partnership. But if he saw a scorner, he offered only the cold, polite boundary of silence. He was no longer a leaf blown by the wind. He was the mountain, rooted and unmoving, reflecting the eternal light of the sun. Years passed, and Elias became a pillar of the community, known more for his wisdom than his wares. One afternoon, beneath the shade of a sprawling olive tree near the gates, a group of young men gathered around him. They were eager and restless, their faces etched with the same impatient fire Elias had once carried. He pulled out the worn, yellowed scroll given to him by the mysterious stranger, its words sharper than any blade. He explained that some hearts choose destruction and cannot be fixed by human hands. He taught them that discernment is the highest form of protection. a shield that guards the mind from unnecessary strife and the soul from bitterness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, Elias shared a final thought on the nature of grace. He reminded the young men that even King Solomon struggled to follow his own rules. Wisdom is not a destination one reaches, but a path one must choose to walk with every breath. It requires a deep humility that acknowledges we are all capable of folly if we lose our connection to the divine. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fading light, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. He had learned that a man of integrity could always find his way through the thorns, guided by the steady lamp of a discerning heart.